Have you ever stopped to notice that the more you try to change your life, the more it seems to remain exactly the same? Not in obvious ways, but in subtle repetitions, the same financial struggles, the same emotional patterns, the same quiet feeling that something is not flowing, even when you are doing everything you were told to do. And maybe, deep inside, there is a question you rarely say out loud. Why does nothing truly change for me? This is where we begin. Not from a place of blame, but from a place of clarity. Because what if the greatest obstacle in your life is not outside of you, not in the economy, not in other people, not even in the timing of the universe, but in something far more intimate, something so close that it has become invisible, the way you think, the way you feel, the way you unconsciously reinforce scarcity without even realizing it. Most people believe they are seeking abundance. They visualize it, they affirm it, they speak about it, but throughout the day their inner world tells a different story. A story of pressure, of comparison, of fear of losing what they don't even have yet. And the body, far more honest than the mind, responds not to what is said, but to what is repeatedly felt. Dr. Joe Dispenza often explains that the body can become addicted to familiar emotions, even when those emotions are painful. It is as if your system learns to survive within a certain emotional pattern, and anything outside of it feels unfamiliar, even unsafe. So you may consciously desire change, but unconsciously, your entire system resists it. This is not failure. This is conditioning. And once you begin to see this, something shifts. Because manifestation is no longer about asking more from the universe. It becomes about observing what you are constantly sending back to it. There is a quiet pattern that shapes reality long before any external result appears. It does not announce itself loudly, nor does it come with obvious signs. It hides in the background of ordinary days, in the subtle tone of your thoughts, in the tension of your body when you check your bank account, in the way your breath shortens when uncertainty arises. Scarcity is rarely just a condition. It is a state that becomes familiar, almost like an internal climate that you carry with you wherever you go. You may wake up with intentions of growth, of expansion, of change. You may even speak words that sound aligned with abundance. But beneath those words, there is often an undercurrent, a low, persistent frequency that whispers something else entirely. It says that things are not enough yet, that something is missing, that time is running out. And the body listens to that whisper far more than it listens to any conscious affirmation. What most people do not realize is that the brain is not designed to prioritize truth. It is designed to prioritize familiarity. This means that if you have spent years, or even decades, rehearsing emotional states of worry, comparison, or subtle fear, your system begins to treat those states as normal, not because they are beneficial, but because they are known. And what is known feels safe, even when it limits you. This is where the contradiction begins. You desire abundance, but your internal system has been trained to expect lack. You imagine a different future, but your nervous system is anchored in a past that keeps repeating itself through emotional memory. It is not that you are thinking incorrectly in isolated moments. It is that your emotional baseline continues to send signals that contradict what you consciously want. There is a moment, often unnoticed, when this becomes visible. It might happen when you receive an opportunity and immediately question it, when something good approaches and your first reaction is doubt instead of openness, when rest feels uncomfortable, as if you should be doing more, fixing more, proving more. These are not random reactions. They are echoes of a deeper pattern, one that has been reinforced over time through repetition. Scarcity, in this sense, is not simply about money or material resources. It is about a continuous orientation toward insufficiency. It is the inability to fully inhabit a moment without anticipating loss. It is the subtle tension that prevents you from receiving without calculating what might go wrong next. And because this orientation is internal, it shapes perception itself. You begin to notice what confirms the pattern, while overlooking what contradicts it. This is why many people feel stuck even when circumstances begin to shift. They may change environments, improve their situation, or even experience temporary breakthroughs, but the internal structure remains the same. And over time, that structure pulls them back into familiar outcomes, not because they are incapable of change, but because their system has not yet learned how to sustain a different state. There is something almost paradoxical about this. The very effort to escape scarcity can reinforce it. The urgency to fix everything, to finally arrive somewhere better, carries within it the assumption that where you are is not enough. And that assumption, repeated often enough, becomes the lens through which everything is interpreted. In quiet moments, when there is nothing to chase or prove, this pattern becomes more visible. It shows itself in restlessness, in the inability to simply be without reaching for something else. And this restlessness is not a flaw, it is a signal, a reflection of a system that has learned to associate stillness with risk and movement with control. Understanding this does not require force, it requires observation. Not judgment, not correction, but a willingness to see what has been operating beneath the surface for a long time. Because once you begin to notice how scarcity is reinforced, not just in thoughts, but in emotions and reactions, a different kind of awareness starts to emerge. And from that awareness, something new becomes possible, not because the universe suddenly changes, but because the way you relate to yourself begins to shift, slowly, quietly, and with a depth that no external strategy can replace. There is a deeper layer beneath thought, one that is rarely questioned because it feels like identity. It is not just what you think in a given moment, but who you believe yourself to be while thinking it. This identity is not formed in a single decision. It is shaped slowly through years of repetition, through experiences that leave emotional imprints, through moments where you learned, consciously or not, what to expect from life. And over time, something subtle happens. The identity built around effort, struggle, or survival becomes familiar. It begins to define how you interpret every new possibility. Even when something different appears, it is filtered through a structure that was not designed to receive it. It is as if a new opportunity arrives, but it must pass through an old version of you that does not fully recognize it as safe or sustainable. This is where many contradictions take root. There is a desire for expansion, but also an attachment to the version of self that learned to endure limitation. There is a longing for ease, but also a quiet belief that ease must be earned through tension. And these layers coexist, often without being consciously noticed, shaping reactions that seem automatic. Carl Jung described the idea that parts of ourselves remain hidden, not because they are insignificant, but because they are too unfamiliar or uncomfortable to integrate. These hidden aspects, often referred to as the shadow, do not disappear. They continue to influence behavior from beneath the surface. In the context of scarcity, this shadow may include fear of receiving, fear of standing out, or even fear of losing connection with others if one's life begins to change. It may seem counterintuitive, but sometimes the resistance to abundance is not about the external world. It is about the internal consequences of becoming someone different. Growth can create distance from old environments, old roles, old expectations, and for a system that has learned to associate belonging with survival, this distance can feel threatening, even if it leads to expansion. This is why change often feels heavier than it appears. It is not just about adjusting habits or shifting perspective. It is about allowing parts of the old identity to dissolve, and this process is rarely comfortable. There can be a sense of disorientation, as if the ground beneath you is shifting, as if the familiar ways of defining yourself are no longer as stable as they once were. Within this transition, many people unknowingly return to what feels known, not because they consciously choose limitation, but because the nervous system seeks stability. Even if that stability is rooted in patterns that no longer serve them, it offers a sense of predictability. And predictability, in the language of the body, is often mistaken for safety. There are moments when this becomes visible in small ways. A hesitation before accepting something positive, a tendency to downplay progress, a quiet discomfort when things begin to flow more easily than expected. These reactions are not random. They reflect an internal structure that is adjusting, slowly, to a different way of being. What complicates this even further is the belief that manifestation is only about attracting external results. When the focus remains there, the deeper process is overlooked. The process of becoming someone who can sustain those results without tension, without fear, without the constant expectation of loss. Because without that internal shift, even the most desired outcomes can feel temporary. There is a kind of silence that emerges when these patterns are observed without resistance, not a silence of emptiness but of space, a space where identity is no longer rigid, where reactions are no longer automatic, where something new can begin to take shape without being immediately pulled back into the past. And in that space, the relationship with abundance begins to change, not as something distant to be achieved, but as something that requires a different way of inhabiting oneself, a way that does not rely on the old definitions of worth, struggle, or control, but gradually opens to a form of stability that is not built on fear. This shift does not happen all at once. It unfolds quietly, often in moments that seem insignificant. But over time, these moments accumulate, creating a subtle but undeniable transformation, not only in what is experienced externally, but in the way experience itself is held internally. There is a point in this inner journey where the struggle is no longer about understanding concepts, but about facing something far more intimate, the realization that the patterns shaping your life are not only mental habits, but emotional loyalties. Loyalties to versions of yourself that were built in moments of uncertainty, in times when control felt necessary, when holding tightly to what little was available seemed like the only way to remain safe. Over time, these emotional loyalties become invisible agreements that define how much you allow yourself to receive, how long you permit something good to last, how deeply you trust moments of stability. Even when the external world begins to shift, these internal agreements remain active, quietly guiding your reactions, often without your awareness. It is in these moments that a subtle tension appears, not a dramatic resistance, but a quiet contraction, a sense that something is unfamiliar, slightly uncomfortable, almost as if ease itself requires justification. This tension is rarely questioned because it feels normal. It has been present for so long that it blends into the background of everyday experience. But if you observe closely, there is a pattern. When something begins to expand, there is a movement inward, a pulling back. When an opportunity arises, there is a hesitation, a need to analyze, to anticipate what might go wrong. When rest appears, there is an impulse to interrupt it, to return to effort, to activity, to something that feels more controlled. This movement is not random. It reflects a system that has learned to associate value with effort and stability with vigilance. In such a system, abundance is not immediately recognized as safe. It is interpreted as temporary, fragile, something that must be protected or questioned. And because of this interpretation, the body does not fully relax into it. Joe Dispenza speaks about the importance of coherence between the mind and the body, suggesting that true change occurs when both are aligned in a new state of being. Yet for many, the mind moves ahead of the body. The thoughts begin to shift, the intentions become clearer, but the body continues to operate from past emotional experiences. And this gap creates friction. It is within this friction that scarcity is reinforced, not through conscious choice, but through repetition. The body returns to familiar sensations, the mind tries to compensate with new ideas, and the cycle continues. Not because change is impossible, but because the system has not yet integrated a new way of feeling. There is also a subtle attachment to the narrative of struggle, not because suffering is desired, but because it has been a constant reference point. It has shaped decisions, defined identity, and even provided a sense of meaning. Letting go of this narrative is not simply about embracing something better. It is about releasing a structure that once felt necessary. And this release is rarely immediate. It unfolds in layers, in moments where awareness interrupts automatic reactions. A moment where the usual tension is noticed instead of followed. A moment where the familiar urge to control is observed rather than acted upon. These moments may seem small, but they represent a shift in orientation. Instead of moving from reaction, there is a brief pause. Instead of reinforcing the old pattern, there is space for something else to emerge. Not forced, not imposed, but gradually revealed. A different response, a different emotional tone, a different way of inhabiting the same situation. This is where transformation begins to take root, not in dramatic external changes, but in subtle internal adjustments. The way you respond to uncertainty, the way you experience time, the way you relate to possibility. These shifts may not be immediately visible, but they alter the foundation upon which external reality is built. There is a quiet strength in this process, a strength that does not rely on constant effort, but on presence, on the ability to remain with what arises without immediately trying to reshape it. And within that presence, something stabilizes, a sense of inner continuity that is no longer dependent on external confirmation. As this stability deepens, the relationship with abundance begins to evolve. It is no longer something to chase or secure, but something that can be held without tension, not because everything has changed outside, but because something fundamental has shifted within. There is a moment, often subtle and easily overlooked, when the internal landscape begins to reorganize itself. It does not arrive with certainty or dramatic clarity. It emerges quietly, in the way you start noticing your own reactions instead of immediately becoming them, in the way a familiar emotion appears but does not fully take control as it once did. This shift may seem insignificant at first, but it represents something profound. A separation between who you have been conditioned to be and what is now becoming possible. For a long time, the reinforcement of scarcity has not required conscious effort. It has operated through repetition, through automatic interpretations, through the body's learned responses to uncertainty and change. But when awareness enters the process, even briefly, the cycle is interrupted. Not broken entirely, but softened. There is a gap where there was once immediate reaction. In this gap, something new begins to take shape, not as a forced alternative, but as a different possibility that no longer needs to compete with the old pattern. The mind may still recall familiar concerns, but they no longer carry the same weight. The body may still register tension, but it does not escalate in the same way. There is a subtle deceleration, as if the entire system is learning a new rhythm. What becomes evident in this stage is that abundance is not only about receiving more, but about holding differently, holding time without urgency, holding opportunity without suspicion, holding stillness without the need to escape it. These shifts are not visible externally at first, yet they redefine how experience is processed internally. There is also a change in how uncertainty is perceived. Where there was once a need to predict outcomes, to secure results, to control every variable, there begins to be a tolerance for not knowing, not as resignation, but as a form of openness. The absence of immediate answers no longer triggers the same level of discomfort. Instead, it creates space. This space allows for a different relationship with action. Action is no longer driven solely by the need to resolve tension or escape discomfort. It begins to arise from clarity, from a quieter sense of direction that does not require constant validation. This does not eliminate effort, but it changes its quality. Effort becomes more precise, less reactive, more aligned with an internal state that is gradually stabilizing. Greg Braden often speaks about the coherence between heart and mind, suggesting that when both operate in alignment, the signals we send into the world become more consistent. In practical terms, this coherence is not an abstract idea. It is experienced as a reduction in internal contradiction. Thoughts, emotions, and actions begin to move in the same direction, even if imperfectly. As this coherence develops, the external world may begin to reflect changes, but not always in expected ways. Sometimes it appears as new opportunities, other times as the removal of situations that were sustained by old patterns. In either case, the process is not about immediate reward, but about alignment, about creating conditions where different outcomes can emerge naturally. There is also a quiet recalibration of time. The urgency that once dominated decision-making starts to dissolve, not because time becomes irrelevant, but because the relationship with it changes. Moments are no longer measured only by what they produce, but by how they are experienced. This shift reduces the pressure to constantly move forward, allowing for a more grounded progression. Within this grounded state, receiving becomes less complicated, not because resistance disappears completely, but because it is recognized sooner. It no longer builds unnoticed. It is seen, felt, and gradually released without the same level of identification. And in this process, the system begins to trust itself in a different way. This trust is not based on guarantees or outcomes. It is based on the recognition that internal stability does not depend on external certainty. That even in the presence of change, there is a continuity within, a sense of presence that does not collapse when conditions shift. Over time, This continuity becomes the foundation for a new way of engaging with life, not as a constant effort to correct or control, but as a gradual participation in a flow that no longer feels distant or inaccessible. And within this participation, the reinforcement of scarcity begins to lose its momentum, not through force, but through lack of repetition. As everything settles, what becomes clear is not a new technique or a hidden formula, but a deeper recognition of how life has been quietly shaped from within. The patterns were never random. The repetition was never accidental. There has been a continuity in the way thoughts, emotions, and reactions aligned around a subtle expectation of lack. Not as a conscious decision, but as a learned state that became familiar over time. And yet, something has shifted. Not necessarily in the external world, at least not immediately, but in the way perception begins to unfold. The same situations no longer carry the same emotional weight. The same uncertainties no longer trigger the same urgency. There is space now, where there used to be automatic reaction. There is awareness, where there used to be unconscious repetition. This is where manifestation transforms from an external pursuit into an internal reorganization. No longer about convincing reality to change, but about no longer reinforcing the patterns that kept it the same. The absence of constant tension creates room for a different experience to emerge, one that does not depend on forcing outcomes or resisting the present moment. Over time, this quiet shift becomes stability, a stability that is not rigid, not controlled, but deeply rooted in presence. And from this presence, a different relationship with life begins to form, not based on scarcity, but no longer sustained by it. Now, let me ask you something that may stay with you long after this video ends. If the patterns shaping your life have been repeating silently for years, what part of you is ready to see them clearly and no longer carry them forward? If this message resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and stay connected to this kind of deeper conversation. And before you leave, continue watching the video on your screen, because what comes next might reveal something you have not yet considered.